I've always wanted to spread it out, and I wanted to do a lot of different things, but those couple minutes with Martin, you can't buy or fake chemistry. It's like love.
Before it became a blockbuster franchise, Bad Boys was a gamble. A first-time movie director, a shrinking budget, 2 television stars who hadn't yet proven themselves in theaters, scenes rewritten overnight, explosions almost canceled, and one casting decision that changed action movies forever. These are 21 crazy facts about Bad Boys, 1995, that completely change how you see this film. Number 21. The studio didn't think it would be a hit. It's hard to believe now, but in 1995, Bad Boys was not expected to dominate the box office. In fact, industry insiders predicted it would perform modestly at best. At the time, neither Will Smith nor Martin Lawrence had carried a major theatrical action film. Both were television stars. Smith was known primarily for The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, while Lawrence was dominating ratings with Martin. But TV fame didn't automatically translate to box office success. Sony Pictures viewed the project as a mid-level action comedy, something that might make decent money but wasn't expected to launch careers. The production budget hovered around $19 million, which was relatively modest even in the mid-90s. Compared to massive action films of the era, this was considered a gamble. Even more concerning, the buddy cop genre had already peaked in the late 80s with films like Lethal Weapon. Many executives believed audiences were tired of the formula. 2 mismatched cops, big explosions, fast cars, sharp one-liners. It wasn't new anymore. Test tracking before release showed mild interest, but not explosive anticipation. And yet, when Bad Boys opened in April 1995, it shocked analysts by debuting at number 1 at the box office. Word of mouth spread quickly. Audiences responded to the chemistry, the energy, and the slick visual style. By the end of its run, the film grossed over $140 million worldwide, more than 7 times its production budget. What was supposed to be a modest action flick became the foundation of a franchise that would stretch across decades. But that success almost never happened, because originally, the studio wasn't even sure they wanted Will Smith. And that brings us to the next fact. Number 20. Will Smith wasn't the first choice. Today, it's impossible to imagine Bad Boys without Will Smith. But during early development, his casting was far from guaranteed. In 1994, Smith's movie career wasn't yet established. He had appeared in small films, but nothing that screamed action star. Studios saw him as charismatic, but unproven in high-budget cinema. Producers initially considered pairing Martin Lawrence with other actors who already had theatrical credibility. Some reports suggest the studio explored established action names before settling on Smith. Executives were nervous about putting 2 sitcom actors at the center of a major action film. What changed? Chemistry. When Smith and Lawrence did early read-throughs together, the dynamic was electric. Their personalities clashed in exactly the right way. Smith's cool, composed style contrasted perfectly with Lawrence's louder, more explosive comedic rhythm. Producers realized they weren't just casting 2 leads, they were casting a partnership. Even so, salary negotiations reflected the imbalance in industry perception. At the time, Martin Lawrence was considered the bigger star due to stronger TV ratings and stand-up success. Smith's deal reflected that hierarchy. Ironically, this film would completely flip that narrative. After Bad Boys succeeded, Smith's career trajectory skyrocketed. Within just a few years, he would headline Independence Day and Men in Black, cementing his place as one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. But none of that was guaranteed when Bad Boys began production. In fact, the biggest gamble wasn't the actors, it was the director. And the studio had even more doubts about him. Number 19. A first-time film director took the risk. When Bad Boys went into production, the studio wasn't just gambling on 2 television stars. They were also handing the project to a director who had never made a feature film. That director was Michael Bay. At the time, Bay was known for high-energy commercials and music videos. He had directed glossy ads for major brands and stylish videos filled with quick cuts, dramatic lighting, and cinematic flair. But a full-length action movie? That was another level entirely. Many studio executives were nervous. Feature filmmaking is different from commercials. You're not just creating striking visuals, you're managing pacing, character arcs, large crews, and multi-million-dollar logistics. Giving that responsibility to a first-time director was considered risky, but producer Don Simpson saw something special in Bay's style. Along with partner Jerry Bruckheimer, Simpson believed Bay's bold, kinetic visual approach could modernize the buddy cop genre. And they were right. From the moment Bad Boys begins, the visual style is unmistakable. The low-angle hero shots, the the glossy, sun-soaked Miami backdrops, the slow-motion walks toward the camera. The dramatic camera spins around characters mid-conversation. It felt bigger, louder, and flashier than most action films of the time. Bay didn't just direct the movie, he branded it. However, his style also caused friction. Bay pushed for larger explosions, more elaborate action beats, and high-impact visuals. The studio, working with a limited budget, frequently pushed back. There were arguments over shooting schedules, stunt costs, and camera setups. At one point, there were even whispers that Bay might be replaced if production spiraled out of control. But he held firm. What emerged wasn't just a successful film, it was the birth of what critics would later call the Bay style. A hyperkinetic, explosive filmmaking approach that would define blockbusters for decades. And yet, despite the energy on screen, behind the scenes, the production was under serious financial pressure. Because halfway through filming, the money started running out. Number 18. The budget was slashed mid-production. Even though Bad Boys looks like a big-budget action spectacle, the reality behind the scenes was far more stressful. The film's production budget was set at roughly $19 million, a modest figure even by mid-90s standards. For comparison, many action films at the time were costing significantly more, especially those filled with car chases, explosions, and elaborate stunt work. And then things got tighter. As filming progressed, costs began to creep upward. Action scenes ran long. Setups took longer than expected. Director Michael Bay wanted bigger visuals, more dynamic camera moves, and explosive set pieces that stretched the limits of what the budget could support. The studio became concerned. Reports from production suggest that funding was restricted mid-shoot. Certain planned action sequences had to be scaled back. Locations were adjusted, some sequences were simplified. There were days when the crew had to move fast, very fast, because overtime simply wasn't an option. This pressure forced creativity. Instead of relying purely on expensive stunts, Bay leaned heavily into visual style. He used lighting, camera angles, and editing to make scenes feel larger than they actually were. Tight framing and dramatic music gave moments more intensity without adding cost. One major example was the climactic airport hangar sequence. While it feels massive on screen, with gunfire, explosions, and high drama, the production team had to choreograph it carefully within strict financial limits. Ironically, those limitations helped shape the movie's identity. The fast pacing, sharp cuts, and explosive energy weren't just stylistic choices, they were solutions to financial constraints. Every shot had to count. Every second of screen time needed impact. Instead of weakening the film, the pressure sharpened it. But financial strain wasn't the only challenge. Because there was another problem that nearly derailed everything. The script wasn't ready, and that leads to one of the most surprising facts about Bad Boys. Number 17. Improvisation saved the script. One of the biggest surprises about Bad Boys is that the script wasn't fully polished when cameras started rolling. In fact, large portions of dialogue were either rewritten during production or created on the spot. The original screenplay had the basic structure: 2 Miami narcotics detectives, stolen heroin, a witness in danger, and escalating action. But the tone wasn't quite there. Early drafts leaned more straightforward and serious, without the sharp, comedic rhythm that ultimately defined the film. That's where Will Smith and Martin Lawrence stepped in. Both actors came from strong improvisational backgrounds. Smith had years of sitcom timing from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, while Lawrence's stand-up and sitcom experience on Martin gave him lightning-fast comedic instincts. Director Michael Bay quickly realized something important. The magic wasn't just in the written lines, it was in the back-and-forth energy between the two leads, so he gave them space. Many of the film's funniest exchanges, arguments about money, insults traded during car rides, exaggerated reactions to danger, were partially improvised. Scenes would often begin with scripted dialogue, then evolve naturally as the actors riffed off each other. This looseness added authenticity. The banter felt real. It didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded like two longtime partners who genuinely annoyed each other and loved it. However, improvisation also created challenges. Continuity became tricky. Editors had multiple variations of the same scene. Timing had to be tightened in post-production to maintain pacing, but the risk paid off. The personality-driven comedy became the heartbeat of the film. Without that spontaneity, Bad Boys might have felt like just another mid-90s action movie. Instead, it felt alive. And yet, while the dialogue felt spontaneous, one of the film's most iconic visual elements was almost completely absent. Because believe it or not, the Porsche nearly didn't make the movie at all. Number 16. The Porsche 911 almost wasn't in the film. When you think of Bad Boys, one image instantly comes to mind: the sleek black Porsche 911 Turbo speeding through sunlit Miami streets. But that car almost never appeared in the film. Originally, the production did not have the budget to secure an exotic sports car. With financial pressure already mounting, renting high-end vehicles for long shooting schedules was considered unnecessary by some studio executives. The film could have easily featured a more modest police vehicle or a standard sports coupe. However, director Michael Bay understood something critical about visual identity. He wanted Marcus and Mike Lowrey, especially Mike, to feel larger than life. Stylish, flashy, aspirational. The Porsche wasn't just transportation, it was character development. Mike Lowrey, played by Will Smith, is portrayed as smooth, confident, and financially comfortable. Driving a high-performance European sports car immediately communicates status without needing exposition. Negotiations reportedly took place to secure the vehicle through promotional agreements. Product placement wasn't as aggressively integrated into films at the time as it would become later, but partnerships like this helped stretch the tight budget. When the Porsche finally appeared on set, it changed the visual tone of the movie. Suddenly, the film felt premium. The glossy black finish under Miami sunlight, the engine roar during high-speed chases, the way the camera lingered on the curves of the car, it all elevated the movie's production value. And audiences noticed. The Porsche 911 Turbo became one of the most memorable elements of the film. It reinforced the stylish, high-energy vibe that separated Bad Boys from other buddy cop films. Ironically, something nearly cut for budget reasons ended up becoming one of the franchise's defining images. But flashy cars weren't the only thing the studio questioned, because there was another major element executives wanted to scale back: the explosions. And that could have changed everything. Number 15. The explosions almost didn't happen. If there's one thing people associate with director Michael Bay, it's explosions. But during the making of Bad Boys, those explosive moments were far from guaranteed. Remember, this was a relatively modest $19 million production. Every stunt, every fireball, every shattered window had a price tag attached. And the studio was watching closely. Early in production, executives reportedly pushed for fewer large-scale action beats. Their thinking was simple: lean into the comedy, reduce the costly destruction, and keep the project safe. After all, this wasn't positioned as a massive summer blockbuster, it was supposed to be a stylish, contained action comedy. Michael Bay disagreed. He believed spectacle was essential. He wanted audiences to feel the impact, to hear the gunfire echo, to see debris fly, to experience the chaos. For Bay, action wasn't background noise, it was the engine. This created tension. Each explosive sequence had to be carefully justified. Stunt teams were given strict limitations. Effects were choreographed precisely to avoid costly retakes. Some planned sequences were reduced in scale, while others were creatively staged to appear bigger than they actually were. The airport hangar climax is a perfect example. On screen, it feels massive. Flames bursting, bullets flying, villains scrambling. In reality, much of that impact came from tight editing, strategic camera placement, and controlled pyrotechnics rather than large-scale destruction. Bay leaned heavily on visual intensity rather than pure volume, slow motion. Dramatic angles, culty close-ups of shell casings hitting the ground. Quick-cut editing to amplify chaos. What makes this fact so fascinating is that these budget limitations forced Bay to refine his style. He couldn't rely solely on size. He had to rely on rhythm and energy, and audiences responded. The action in Bad Boys felt sharp and modern compared to slower-paced 80s films. It signaled a new direction for action cinema: faster, louder, more stylized. Ironically, the very thing the studio wanted to minimize became one of the reasons the film stood out. But action alone wouldn't have worked without a strong supporting cast. And one casting decision, in particular, raised eyebrows across the industry. Number 14. Téa Leoni's casting surprised everyone. When it came time to cast the female lead in Bad Boys, the studio faced a delicate balancing act. The role of Julie Mott wasn't just a typical witness in danger. She would spend much of the film alongside two high-energy, improvisation-heavy comedians in Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. Whoever stepped into that role had to hold her ground without getting lost in the chaos. The choice? Téa Leoni. At the time, Leoni was known for television work and smaller film roles, but she wasn't yet a major box office name. Some insiders questioned whether she could match the fast-paced, loud comedic chemistry happening around her. But that was exactly why the casting worked. Instead of trying to out-comedy the leads, Leoni played Julie with intensity and edge. She wasn't just screaming and reacting, She was sharp, sarcastic, and occasionally combative. Her performance added friction, which strengthened the dynamic. Director Michael Bay reportedly encouraged the natural tension in scenes. Julie's frustration with the detective's immaturity wasn't just scripted, it reflected the energy on set. Smith and Lawrence were often riffing, joking, and improvising. Leone's grounded reactions helped anchor those moments. There's also another layer. The mistaken identity subplot, where Marcus must pretend to be Mike, put Leone's character at the center of some of the film's funniest and most awkward situations. Those scenes required precise timing. Too exaggerated and they'd feel cartoonish. Too serious and the comedy would fall flat. Leone found the balance. Looking back, her performance helped give the movie emotional stakes. Without her character, the film could have felt like pure chaos. With her, there was structure. What's fascinating is that her casting wasn't initially seen as a headline-making move, but in hindsight, it was essential. Because the mistaken identity storyline, one of the film's funniest elements, wasn't even central in early drafts. And that twist almost didn't happen at all. Number 13. The identity swap plot wasn't originally the focus. One of the funniest and most memorable parts of Bad Boys is the identity swap, when Marcus pretends to be Mike to protect Julie, while Mike ends up posing as Marcus at home. But here's the surprising part. That concept wasn't originally the central engine of the film. Early drafts of the script leaned much more heavily on the crime thriller aspect. The stolen heroin, the internal police pressure, the escalating conflict with the villain. The story played straighter, with comedy layered in rather than driving the narrative. During development, producers and director Michael Bay began to realize something important. The real magic wasn't just in gunfights or chases, it was in the chemistry between Martin Lawrence and Will Smith. The identity swap idea allowed that chemistry to explode. When Marcus has to pretend he's the wealthy, smooth-talking Mike Lowry, the comedic potential multiplies instantly. Suddenly, you have a family man forced to live a bachelor's flashy lifestyle. At the same time, Mike must navigate Marcus's home life, complete with kids and domestic tension. It created built-in conflict. The swap also raised the stakes for Julie's protection. She could only trust the detective she believed was Mike. That narrative constraint forced the characters into increasingly absurd and hilarious situations. On set, this shift toward the identity storyline opened the door for more improvisation. Arguments felt sharper. Reactions felt more exaggerated. Scenes gained rhythm because they were rooted in deception and tension. This pivot during development changed the entire tone of the movie. Instead of being just another 90s cop thriller, Bad Boys became a personality-driven action comedy. And that balance, comedy anchored inside high-stakes crime, gave the film staying power. But tone wasn't shaped by writing alone. The setting itself played a huge role. Because Miami wasn't just a backdrop, it became a character. Number 12. Miami became a character in the film. From the very first frame of Bad Boys, you can feel it. The sunlight, the palm trees, the pastel buildings, the humid glow bouncing off glass and chrome. Miami wasn't just a filming location, it was a personality. Director Michael Bay made a deliberate choice to lean heavily into the city's visual identity. Instead of gritty alleyways and rain-soaked streets typical of 80s cop movies, Bad Boys showcased bright skies, waterfront mansions, neon nightlife, and high-end architecture. The effect was immediate. The film felt modern. Cinematography emphasized wide angles and vibrant color palettes. The camera lingered on luxury homes, flashy cars, and ocean views. It created contrast, explosive violence unfolding in beautiful sun-drenched environments. That contrast gave the movie a distinctive flavor. Previous buddy cop films like Lethal Weapon leaned darker and moodier. Bad Boys flipped that formula. Crime and chaos unfolded under clear blue skies. Miami's cultural energy also influenced the soundtrack and pacing. The city's blend of Latin rhythms, hip-hop, and urban nightlife gave the movie a pulse. It didn't feel generic, it felt specific. And that specificity helped the film stand out in a crowded genre. Even the villains' hideouts reflected Miami's upscale aesthetic. Sleek waterfront properties replaced dingy warehouses. The visual polish elevated the movie beyond its modest budget. This glossy style would later become part of Bay's signature approach. Dramatic slow-motion shots against sunlit backdrops, characters framed heroically with sky and architecture behind them. Miami allowed Bay to turn style into substance. Looking back, it's hard to imagine Bad Boys set anywhere else. The city amplified everything: the comedy, the swagger, the action. But visuals alone don't define tone. Music does. and the soundtrack played a major role in shaping how audiences experienced this film. Number 11. The soundtrack changed the energy of action movies. Before a single line of dialogue sticks in your head, before the first big explosion hits the screen, Bad Boys announces itself with sound. And that sound was different. In the early 1990s, action movies often relied heavily on orchestral scores and hard rock tracks. The energy was intense, but it followed a familiar formula. Bad Boys shifted that formula by blending a traditional action score with contemporary hip-hop and R&B influences that felt current and urban. The soundtrack helped define the film's rhythm. The title track, Shy Guy, by Diana King, became synonymous with the movie's identity. Its Caribbean-infused groove perfectly matched Miami's vibe. It wasn't just background music, it was atmosphere. The film's score, composed by Mark Mancina, also played a key role. Mancina blended orchestral tension with modern beats, creating something that felt cinematic yet contemporary. The music moved fast, just like the camera work. What made this important? It signaled a shift in tone for mainstream action films. Instead of feeling like a carryover from the 1980s, Bad Boys felt plugged into the mid-90s cultural moment. The soundtrack amplified the swagger of Will Smith and the sharp comedic timing of Martin Lawrence. The music didn't overpower scenes, it energized them. Car chases felt smoother. Slow-motion walks felt cooler. Dialogue exchanges felt punchier because the rhythm underneath them never dragged. This fusion of hip-hop influence and blockbuster scoring would become more common in later action films. But in 1995, it felt fresh. The soundtrack also helped with marketing. Radio airplay extended the film's cultural presence beyond theaters. Even people who hadn't seen the movie recognized its musical identity. In many ways, the sound design and soundtrack were as important as the visuals in shaping the movie's personality. But even with stylish music, glossy cinematography, and electric chemistry, the film still faced a crucial test. Test audiences, and their reactions nearly changed the final cut. Number 10. Test screenings almost changed the ending. Even after filming wrapped on Bad Boys, the movie wasn't locked in. Like many studio projects, it went through multiple test screenings, private showings where selected audiences watched early cuts and gave honest feedback. And those reactions mattered more than people realize. Early screening responses were strong in one area: chemistry. Viewers loved the back and forth between Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. The comedic tension worked. The personality clashes landed. The crowd laughed at the right moments. But there were concerns. Some viewers felt the pacing dragged in certain sections. Others thought the tonal balance between comedy and violence needed tightening. A few responses even suggested that the villain lacked presence compared to the charismatic leads. Director Michael Bay and the editors took those notes seriously. Several scenes were trimmed to sharpen momentum. Dialogue exchanges were tightened. Action beats were slightly restructured in the final act to increase intensity. Even the rhythm of the airport climax was adjusted to build more urgency before the final confrontation. The ending itself was refined to emphasize partnership over spectacle. Instead of simply focusing on defeating the villain, the film leaned harder into the bond between the two detectives. That emotional reinforcement left audiences walking out remembering the characters, not just the explosions. Test screenings also confirmed something important. Viewers weren't just interested in the crime plot. They were invested in Mike and Marcus. That insight helped solidify the franchise potential. The final theatrical cut became faster, punchier, and more personality-driven than some earlier versions. And when it finally hit theaters, the response proved the adjustments worked. But even as audiences embraced the film, critics were not nearly as unified. Because when Bad Boys was released, reviews were divided, and that split reaction became part of its legacy. Number 9. Critics were divided, but audiences didn't care. When Bad Boys hit theaters in April 1995, audiences showed up. Critics? Not all of them were impressed. At the time, several reviewers felt the movie prioritized style over substance. They pointed to the flashy camera moves, loud action, and glossy visuals as excessive. Some argued the plot was thin. Others believed the humor was uneven. A few even criticized director Michael Bay for focusing more on spectacle than storytelling. But here's the key difference. Regular moviegoers didn't see it that way. Audiences connected with the chemistry between Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. They laughed at the banter. They enjoyed the fast pace. They appreciated the modern energy. Word of mouth spread quickly. This gap between critics and audiences wasn't new, but in this case, it became a defining moment. The film opened at number 1 at the box office. Strong ticket sales continued in the following weeks. It didn't just recover its modest budget, it multiplied it. What's fascinating is that many of the stylistic choices critics questioned would later become industry standards. Fast-cut editing, dramatic slow-motion entrances, music video-inspired camera work, glossy color grading. What was once considered too flashy eventually became mainstream blockbuster language. Over time, reevaluation also shifted perception. As sequels expanded the franchise and Will Smith became one of the biggest movie stars on the planet, the original film gained retrospective appreciation. It wasn't just an action comedy, it was the launchpad for something bigger. And that's what makes this fact so important. Initial reviews didn't define the film's legacy. Audience reaction did. But beyond reviews and box office numbers, there was another major impact. Because Bad Boys didn't just succeed, it revived an entire genre. Number 8. It revived the buddy cop genre. By the mid-1990s, the buddy cop formula was running on fumes. The genre had exploded in the late 80s with hits like Lethal Weapon, pairing mismatched personalities in high-stakes crime stories. But by 1995, audiences had seen the formula repeated again and again. The reckless cop and the by-the-book partner, big shootouts, sarcastic banter, predictable arcs. Studios believed the genre had peaked. Then Bad Boys arrived. Instead of reinventing the structure, it modernized it. Director Michael Bay injected speed and visual flair. The film moved faster, looked brighter, and sounded sharper than its predecessors. More importantly, the dynamic between Will Smith and Martin Lawrence felt contemporary. Their banter wasn't just sarcastic, it was rhythm-driven, shaped by 90s sitcom timing and stand-up comedy energy. The film leaned into personality over plot. Where earlier buddy cop movies often balanced equal seriousness and humor, Bad Boys unapologetically amplified the comedy without sacrificing intensity. The identity swap subplot added fresh chaos. The Miami backdrop added style. The soundtrack added cultural immediacy. Suddenly, the genre didn't feel tired. It felt updated. The success of Bad Boys proved there was still appetite for this type of film, if it evolved with the times. In the years that followed, studios would greenlight more action comedies built around strong personality pairings, faster pacing, and slicker production value. It also demonstrated that younger, television-born actors could carry theatrical action films successfully. In short, Bad Boys didn't reinvent the buddy cop movie, it re-energized it. And in doing so, it quietly set the stage for something no one predicted at the time, a long-running franchise that would stretch decades beyond its modest 1995 debut. Because this wasn't meant to be a series, it was supposed to be a one-and-done project. And that makes the next fact even more surprising. Number 7. It was never planned as a franchise. Today, when people hear the name Bad Boys, they think of a long-running series filled with escalating action, bigger budgets, and decades of history. But in 1995, no one was thinking about sequels. The film was developed as a standalone project, a mid-budget action comedy designed to make a profit and move on. There were no long-term universe plans, no multi-film contracts mapping out the future, no guarantee that audiences would demand more. In fact, because the studio initially saw the movie as a modest gamble, long-term planning wasn't even part of the conversation. Everything changed after opening weekend. When the film debuted at number 1 and continued performing strongly, executives began to reassess. The chemistry between Will Smith and Martin Lawrence was undeniable. Viewers weren't just enjoying the action, they were attached to Mike Lowrey and Marcus Burnett. Director Michael Bay had created characters people wanted to revisit. Still, a sequel didn't happen immediately. It would take years before Bad Boys 2 arrived, and by then, the scale had expanded dramatically. Bigger explosions, bigger budget, larger set pieces, but the foundation was built in 1995. What makes this fact interesting is how organic the franchise growth was. It wasn't engineered from the start. It happened because the first film worked. Audiences connected, and when a movie resonates strongly enough, studios listen. Looking back, that first film feels like the spark that launched something far bigger than anyone involved expected. Yet for all its future success, one element almost shifted the tone entirely during development, because the studio originally wanted the film to feel much darker, and that could have changed everything. Number 6. The studio originally wanted a darker tone. It may be hard to imagine now, but early development of Bad Boys leaned more serious than what audiences eventually saw on screen. Initial drafts of the script emphasized the crime thriller angle, the stolen heroin shipment, internal police department pressure, ruthless criminals operating in Miami's underworld. The tone was sharper, darker, and more grounded in procedural tension. The idea was to create a tough cop drama with occasional humor, not a personality-driven action comedy. But once Will Smith and Martin Lawrence were cast, the energy shifted. Both actors brought natural, comedic rhythm to their roles. During rehearsals and early takes, their banter began to dominate scenes. Even straightforward conversations carried humor. Their chemistry was too strong to ignore. Director Michael Bay recognized the opportunity. Instead of resisting it, he leaned into it. The studio initially hesitated. There was concern that too much comedy might dilute the stakes. Action films at the time often relied on seriousness to maintain tension. Executives worried that audiences might not take the danger seriously if jokes were flying during gunfights. But something interesting happened during production and test screenings. Viewers didn't see the humor as weakening the film. They saw it as enhancing it. The comedic tension actually made the serious moments sharper. When explosions happened, they felt bigger because they interrupted humor. When arguments broke out mid-chase, they felt authentic rather than forced. The film found its balance. Crime plot on one side, personality-driven chaos on the other. If the studio had insisted on a darker tone, Bad Boys might have felt like dozens of other 90s cop thrillers. Instead, it carved its own lane. And that tonal shift helped launch the careers of the two men at its center. Because while Martin Lawrence was already a television powerhouse at the time, this film quietly transformed Will Smith into something else entirely, a future blockbuster king. And that might be the most important legacy of all. Number 5. This film turned Will Smith into a global action star. In 1995, Will Smith was popular. After The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, he was charismatic, recognizable, and well-liked, but he wasn't yet seen as a major movie star, let alone an action headliner. Bad Boys changed that. The film gave Smith something television couldn't: scale. On the big screen, his presence felt different. The slow-motion hero shots, the confident one-liners, the tailored suits, the Porsche 911. Mike Lowrey wasn't just funny, he was cool, controlled, stylish, capable. Audiences responded immediately. While Martin Lawrence carried explosive comedic energy, Smith projected calm authority. That balance allowed him to step into a new lane, the action comedy lead with genuine star power. Hollywood noticed. Within a year, Smith would headline Independence Day, one of the biggest blockbusters of the decade. Soon after came Men in Black, cementing him as one of the most bankable actors in the world. Looking back, Bad Boys feels like the bridge. It proved he could carry action. It proved he could command a theatrical audience. It proved he wasn't just a sitcom personality, he was a movie star in the making. What's interesting is that this wasn't obvious during production. At the time, Martin Lawrence was arguably the bigger television name. Industry perception didn't automatically favor Smith. But once the movie hit theaters, the shift was clear. Mike Lowrey became iconic, and that momentum helped define Smith's trajectory for the next decade. But while Smith's career exploded after the film, behind the scenes there was tension during production, because the director and the studio didn't always see eye to eye, and those clashes nearly changed the movie entirely. Number 4. Michael Bay and the studio clashed constantly. By the time Bad Boys was deep into production, tension behind the scenes was building. Director Michael Bay had strong visual instincts. He wanted bigger action beats, more dramatic camera moves, and high-impact sequences that felt larger than the film's modest budget. The studio, however, was focused on staying within strict financial limits. That difference in priorities led to frequent clashes. They pushed for dynamic crane shots, elaborate staging, and heightened spectacle. Executives questioned whether those elements were necessary. Every added explosion, every extended action setup, every extra day of shooting came with scrutiny. At one point, there were serious concerns that Bay's ambitious style might push production too far off schedule. As a first-time feature director, he didn't have the leverage that established filmmakers enjoyed. There were moments when his position wasn't as secure as it would later become, but Bay refused to back down. He believed that style was the movie's identity. Without bold visuals, the film risked blending into the crowd of mid-90s cop thrillers. He fought to protect the cinematic scale he envisioned. Ironically, those same stylistic choices became the film's signature. The glossy slow-motion shots, the dramatic camera spins, the low-angle hero framing of Will Smith and Martin Lawrence walking toward danger. These were elements the studio initially viewed as excessive, but audiences embraced them. In hindsight, those creative tensions shaped the final product. Bay had to justify every stylistic flourish, which forced him to refine his approach rather than simply escalate it. The result was a film that felt explosive without feeling bloated. And while the conflicts were intense at the time, they helped define Bay's reputation moving forward. uncompromising, visually bold, and relentless in pursuit of spectacle. Yet even with all that tension, one thing on set remained surprisingly strong. The chemistry between the two leads wasn't just acting, it was real. Number 3. The chemistry between Smith and Lawrence was genuine. The heart of Bad Boys isn't the explosions. It isn't the car chases. It isn't even the slick Miami visuals. It's the partnership. What makes the dynamic between Will Smith and Martin Lawrence so convincing is that much of it was rooted in real interaction. From early rehearsals, the two actors clicked, but not in a calm, polished way. Their personalities genuinely contrasted. Smith's measured, confident demeanor balanced against Lawrence's high-energy, rapid-fire, comedic style. That natural difference created friction, and friction created comedy. On set, they challenged each other. Improvised exchanges weren't rehearsed endlessly. Many arguments were built from spontaneous reactions. When Marcus complains, exaggerates, or panics, Lawrence often pushed those moments beyond what was written. Smith would respond in real time, adjusting tone and timing. Director Michael Bay recognized that chemistry immediately. Instead of limiting it, he allowed scenes to breathe. Sometimes cameras kept rolling longer than planned just to capture the authentic rhythm between the two leads. That authenticity translated on screen. Their arguments felt less like scripted jokes and more like long-term partners who genuinely knew how to push each other's buttons. Even during intense action scenes, their verbal sparring never stopped. That consistency gave the relationship depth. What's interesting is that the bond strengthened during production. Long shooting days, tight budgets, and shared pressure built mutual respect. By the end of filming, they weren't just co-stars, they were collaborators who understood how to elevate each other's performances. That partnership became the franchise's foundation. Without it, the movie might have been visually impressive but emotionally hollow. Instead, audiences connected to the relationship. And that connection fueled something far bigger than anyone predicted. Because when the film was released, it didn't just perform well, it exploded at the box office. And that success changed the trajectory of everyone involved. Number 2. Opening weekend shocked Hollywood. When Bad Boys opened in April 1995, expectations were modest. The industry viewed it as a mid-budget action comedy anchored by 2 television stars and directed by a first-time feature filmmaker. It wasn't positioned as a record-breaking event film. There was no assumption that it would dominate the box office. And then the numbers came in. The film debuted at number 1 in North America, exceeding projections and outperforming competing releases. Analysts who had predicted a respectable but unremarkable opening were suddenly reassessing. Word of mouth was strong. Audiences weren't just attending, they were recommending it. The chemistry between Will Smith and Martin Lawrence became the main talking point. Viewers left theaters quoting lines, discussing favorite moments, and praising the energy. For Sony, the surprise was significant. The film's modest $19 million budget meant profitability came quickly. As ticket sales climbed domestically and internationally, it became clear that this wasn't just a small win, it was a breakout success. Director Michael Bay suddenly found himself in demand. Smith's phone started ringing with major offers. Lawrence solidified his standing as a crossover star capable of theatrical draws. Perhaps most importantly, the studio recognized that the pairing itself had franchise potential. This opening weekend didn't just validate the movie, it validated the gamble. Television actors could lead major action films. A commercial director could deliver theatrical spectacle. A revived buddy cop formula could thrive in the 90s landscape. The industry had underestimated the audience's appetite for personality-driven action. And once the dust settled, it was obvious. Bad Boys had overperformed in a way few expected. But there's one final fact that ties everything together. Because this film didn't just succeed financially, it quietly reshaped modern action filmmaking. Number 1. It changed action movies forever. When Bad Boys arrived in 1995, it didn't look like a revolution. It looked like a stylish cop movie with strong chemistry and sharp humor. But over time, its influence became clear. Director Michael Bay introduced a visual language that would soon dominate blockbuster filmmaking. Rapid-fire editing, low-angle hero shots, glossy, high-contrast lighting, slow-motion walks toward danger, dramatic camera spins that turned simple conversations into cinematic moments. In the mid-90s, that style felt bold, almost excessive to some critics. Within a decade, it became standard. Modern action films embraced faster pacing. Music video-inspired cinematography became mainstream. Spectacle grew louder, brighter, and more stylized. The clean, sunlit Miami aesthetic of Bad Boys stood in contrast to the darker tones of earlier cop thrillers, and audiences embraced the change. The film also helped redefine what an action star looked like. Will Smith proved that charisma, humor, and composure could coexist with physical intensity. He wasn't playing a brooding, silent enforcer. He was confident, articulate, and funny, without sacrificing authority. That balance shaped the next generation of action leads. At the same time, the partnership dynamic between Smith and Martin Lawrence showed studios that audiences wanted personality as much as plot. The emotional hook wasn't just the crime, it was the relationship. Looking back, Bad Boys feels like a pivot point. It bridged the gap between 80s buddy cop films and modern action spectacles. It introduced a director whose visual style would dominate blockbusters for years. It launched a franchise no one originally planned, and it proved that sometimes modest gambles create the biggest impact. Nearly 3 decades later, Bad Boys still holds up, not just as an entertaining action comedy, but as a film that quietly reshaped Hollywood expectations. What began as a risky mid-budget project became a cultural touchstone. The chemistry, the style, the energy, it all started here. And once you know these 21 facts, you'll never watch Bad Boys the same way again.